You're preparing for your job interview. You're reviewing your resume. You're reminding yourself of all the great things you've done in your career. You're practicing talking about them. You're learning about the organization. But how often do we stop and think about all the other factors that might come into play and affect if we're able to land that job at the job interview? I'm Matt, and I'm here to talk to you about some of those factors. The purpose of the video is to help you be more aware of these factors, some of the things that you may be able to do to counteract them or to go with them to help you, and also so that the next time you don't get that job you were really excited about at the job interview, you have perspective and realize that maybe it was nothing that you did, and that even if you had the performance of a lifetime at that interview, it may not be you that caused you not to get it. First, I'm going to talk to you about the effectiveness generally of job interviews. Then we'll look at the competition that there is in job postings. Then we'll talk about the mostly unconscious influences that there are on job interviewers. And lastly, we'll talk about some of the things you can do in light of this stuff. But before we go on, please consider liking the video if you find it helpful, and subscribe to the channel for when more videos are uploaded. So job interviews, how effective are they? Do they help us find the best candidate? Well, Leadership IQ's Global Talent Management Survey revealed that only 19% of candidates end up having success, and this was a survey of nearly 2,500 companies. But this hasn't only been studied through surveying organizations, it's been tested by academic researchers. In one such study, participants were asked to predict student GPA for the upcoming semester. To make this prediction, they were able to utilize interviews, GPA from previous semesters, as well as their course schedule. Participants were told that prior GPA was the best predictor of future success. As part of the study, participants were also asked to evaluate one of the students purely based on their GPA and their course schedule, and were not interviewing that one person. Now, furthermore, to complicate the study a little bit more for the participants, some of the respondent students were asked to give random answers to yes and no questions based on the way that the questions were asked. And the participants interviewing the students, among them not one noticed that some students were giving random answers. Now, the first finding of the study is that participants were less accurately able to predict student GPA for those that they interviewed. When they made their predictions purely based on the GPA and the course schedule, their predictions were far more accurate. The researchers then explained these results to the participants. They then asked them to rank the following in order of most helpful in predicting grades: honest interviews, random interviews, or no interviews. And shockingly, no interview was ranked as least valuable in making an assessment of student GPA. This meant that participants would rather have an interview with someone where they're receiving random answers to help them assess what their future GPA would be. And this just shows that people think they're such good judges of others that even though they were shown that interviews were not effective, even though they were told that some interviewees were giving random answers, we think we're such good judges of others that we still want to talk to them, we still want to meet with them face to face, even when we were shown that GPA and course schedule was enough to make the most accurate predictions. Now, the researchers suggested that one way to mitigate this effect was to have structured interviews. Structured interviews are when every candidate is asked the same question in the same way. And this consistency theoretically increases the potential of candidates being evaluated the same way across the group. And this can be contrasted with an unstructured interview where the candidate and the interviewer kind of have a less formal conversation where they try to get to know each other through free-form conversation, which increases the likelihood that there isn't consistency in the way that people are evaluated and increases the probability that factors outside of job capability will be assessed in making the job hiring decision. So if research shows that job interviews are not that effective, why are they still so widely used? Well, some organizations are trying different approaches. Some are relying more heavily on things like written tests. Others are even trying new approaches like holding auditions, where, for example, they ask salespersons to come in and make mock pitches to their team. But it does still seem that there's a general acceptance that job interviews are still the best option available to us, and it doesn't seem like they're going anywhere anytime soon. The next thing I wanted to remind people of is that job postings have tons of competition. In some cases, you could have tens or hundreds or even thousands of other applicants interested in the same job that you are. Now, when you get to the shortlist interview stage, certainly you've got better odds than 1 in 1,000, but you need to remember that the shortlist is composed of other candidates that compare favorably to you, and In some cases, these candidates will actually have more experience than you do. Also, sometimes the amount of experience isn't even the most important thing. Maybe you have 4 times more experience than everyone else on the short list, but in this specific situation, the employer is looking for one specialty because they know there's a specific project coming up and they really need help in one area. Also, if you're applying for a role from outside of an organization or even from outside of a department, you should remember that a hiring manager may have internal candidates or even one specific person already in mind for the job. And maybe the job was only posted because policy required it or some kind of internal politics or pressure required it. The purpose of me talking about this competition is just to remind you that you're one fish in a big sea. And just because you don't get a role, it's not an indictment of you or your experience. Sometimes you're just beat by people who have been doing the work for longer than you have. Now let's talk about the actual interviewers in the interview. You may think when you go into an interview that you're sitting across the table from a highly skilled and practiced individual that has years of experience doing interviews. But the reality is that job interviews are not necessarily treated as some kind of separate skill set that needs to be practiced or honed, and in many cases, interviewers may not even receive training. And as we've already talked about, people may not think that interviewing is a specific thing that you need to work at to be good at because we tend to think of ourselves as very good judges of other people, and so hiring managers probably overestimate their ability to assess job candidates in the interview situation. Now, of course, there's going to be some interviewers that are just naturally better at assessing job candidates, but there's so many potential pitfalls they can fall into. So some examples include maybe they aren't very good at probing for more information, so the interviewee has to give a very complete answer up front because the interviewer won't think to ask for more information. Another example might be an interviewer that's not trained to take a balanced approach to evaluating a candidate. Perhaps they put too much emphasis on technical information for a leadership position, for example. And untrained and inexperienced interviewers may be even more prone to unconscious biases. Now, we may mistakenly think of an unconscious bias as bad or malicious, but cognitive biases, in the case of the type that are influencing people in a job interview, are an example of a shortcut that our brain uses to process a large amount of information around us to help us analyze and understand the world in a quick way. These mental shortcuts are called heuristics, which allow us to quickly make decisions and solve problems and pass judgment about things in the complicated world around us with minimal mental effort. But this quick problem-solving approach that minimizes the mental effort may actually reduce our critical thinking and make us make a decision on the basis of an unjust bias. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of these things in action and show you how these things can come into play without people realizing them and how maybe they impact us in other areas of our life every day. Now, there are so many examples of these mental shortcuts, these biases that exist, but I thought I'd focus on a few just to give you some examples of how they might influence interviewers. So the first example is the similar to me bias, which disproportionately has people favor people that are more like them. And this could be related to things like nationality, background, school that they attended, or even favorite sports team. So while you're sitting there thinking that how you explained your success on that last project that you did and how you came under budget is the thing that's going to be most important to getting that job, it may be that discussion that you had about last night's baseball game that subconsciously has a greater effect on the interviewer if you guys both cheer for the same team. The next couple of biases I wanted to talk about are the halo effect and the horn effect. The halo effect occurs when the interviewer judges one thing particularly positively and allows that positive evaluation to affect their impression of everything else about the candidate. And as you can imagine, the horn effect is the opposite. The interviewer identifies something negative about the candidate and allows that to influence their view of everything else about the candidate in a more negative way. So let's say that the interviewer is particularly impressed by the fact that the candidate has a law degree from a specific school that they admire particularly. This may cause the interviewer to ignore other negatives about the candidate or evaluate other things about the candidate more positively than they should. The next example I wanted to talk about is the first impression bias. They say that you only get one chance to make a good first impression, and in the case of this bias, it's really true. So let's say the interviewee shows up late to the interview, and the interviewer is not particularly impressed with the explanation provided. Now, regardless of what the interviewee says, regardless of their experience and their education, the interviewer is way more likely to judge the interviewee negatively. And yes, ideally, we would all agree it's not great to be late for an interview. But what if the candidate is head and shoulders way better than the competition? This person's going to be with your organization hopefully for at least months and probably years to come. So wouldn't you rather select the most qualified person regardless of this couple minutes of lateness? Well, the first impression bias would say, no, you don't. So the next example I wanted to talk about is the negative emphasis bias. This occurs anytime an interviewer judges a candidate based on a personal characteristic not related to the job, such as tone of voice or height. So let's say the candidate comes in and the interviewer perceives them to be dressed in a way that they consider to be old-fashioned. And then the interviewer starts to think, well, maybe their work style is out of date as well. Maybe they're not comfortable working with new technology. And so the interviewer starts to make negative perceptions about the candidate based on something that has nothing to do with their job performance or their potential to be successful in the job. Now, of course, people are always going to notice these types of characteristics in other people, but the key for an interviewer is to not let it impact their hiring decisions. But now you might think twice about the importance of thinking about dressing for the job that you want next time you go to an interview. The next example I wanted to talk about is contrast effect. This occurs when someone is evaluated particularly negatively after a very positive performance or particularly positively after a bad performance. So just because you interviewed after someone that did particularly well may result in the interviewers evaluating you more harshly than they even realize. So unfortunately, something as simple as the order of the interviews can actually have a major impact on how well your performance is evaluated by the interviewers. Now, I wanted to contrast some of these mental shortcuts, some of these cognitive biases with discrimination. And as you probably know, discrimination occurs when a candidate is judged based on their age or gender or race or sexuality or any other personal characteristic related to who they are as a person. And I wanted to highlight this because although I do think that in the case of cognitive biases, we have a lot of unintended consequences of mental shortcuts of the way our brain works, discrimination is different. And I didn't want to go through this whole video talking about biases without recognizing this very important issue. Now, the reality is that the world is showing more recognition of the impact of discrimination. There's more things being done to try and limit it and eliminate it from any job hiring decisions and from organizations in general. But this ugly phenomenon is still out there, and I just wanted to put it out and recognize that unfortunately it's another factor in the job interview process that may have an adverse impact. So now I wanted to talk about what we can do now that we're aware of all this information. How can we translate this into having good outcomes in job interviews? Because as we talked about, job interviews are probably not going away anytime soon. Despite all of these non-job related things that I talked about, it's still a best practice to practice telling your stories, to think about the best ways to talk about your skills, knowledge, and experience, to practice telling your stories in a natural, clear, and concise way, and to tell your stories in a way that shows your professionalism and why you'd be a good fit for the job. The better you can tell your stories, the more you're likely to distract away from other factors that may have an impact on the hiring decision. And of course, you want to learn as much about the organization as possible going in the interview and be prepared to talk about the organization and some of its challenges. You can also look at who the interviewers are and learn about them as well. The more you learn about them, the more likely you're going to be able to relate to them, and you're going to be able to hopefully trigger that similar to me bias to your interest and make that connection with the interviewer and possibly have them subconsciously think of you more favorably. And so thinking about relating to the interviewers and connecting with them, you don't want to just go in and regurgitate memorized stories. You want to be able to talk to them in a free-flowing way. You want to have a discussion with them and to talk to them about your skills in a way that flows with how the discussion is going in the interview. You want to make a personal connection with those interviewers as much as possible. Interviews tend to favor people who are good at telling stories. So you want to work at this skill, you want to develop it, and you want to improve at telling your stories as much as you can. Now, you shouldn't get too distracted by the information I've shared with you today. That wasn't the purpose of this. The purpose of this was to remind you that there's so many other things in play when it comes to a job interview. And so if you don't get the job after even what you perceive to be a good job interview, it may have nothing to do with you. You can practice, you can study, you can take extra courses, but none of this may actually be the reason you didn't land the job at your job interview. And the reason I wanted to emphasize this is I've met so many people over the years that have felt so negative after not getting a job, after thinking they did well in the job interview. And at the end of the day, sometimes your mediocre interview will land you the job, and sometimes your killer interview will not get you the job. Again, you need to have perspective and realize one job interview is not an indictment of you. Now, of course, you should reflect on your interview and think about how you can improve. You should ask for feedback from the interviewers where you can to find out where they feel like you could have done better or explain something more clearly. However, the idea here is just not to get too low if, for whatever reason, you're not successful in one particular job interview. And from my perspective, it's always better to have more information. And even if after this video you don't change your approach to interview prep, you still tell your stories in the same way, it can't hurt to be aware of some of these dynamics and have them in the back of your mind. But maybe the next time you hear the interviewer talking to the other panelist about last night's baseball game, you may take the opportunity to chime in and know that you might be triggering a bias in your favor. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you did, please like it and subscribe to the channel for when more videos are uploaded. And in the comments, tell me if there's anything that I talked about today that's particularly surprising. Which biases have you seen in play? Is there a bias in hindsight that you think was in play in an interview you had before that you didn't realize until now? Thanks for making it to the end of the video, and keep working really hard to get yourself that dream job. Have a great day.